Hello, this is Carl from Denmark, and this is a follow-up to a video I made shortly ago about Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band. That previous video was mainly about being released under license in another country, so another country label released it in that country. That was mainly about that subject, and I didn't get much into talking about the Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band. I just mentioned that they were popular not just in Denmark but in the most of Europe. Actually, they were bigger in Sweden than in Denmark, and they toured all over Europe. That was about what I said. So, not much going into detail and telling the story of the band and who the different members was and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm aiming to do in this video. The band was formed in 1956. Originally they were called just the New Orleans Jazz Band. But a little later on, the American singer Shel Silverstein was in Denmark and heard them, and he saw those guys with those big beards and actually thought they were Vikings, and they thought that was funny, and so they changed the name to Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band, and the name stick on through many years further on. Arne Bue Jensen, called Papa, was the trombone player and the leader. You know, a little like Chris Barber in his band. And there are another similarity because, you know, in the original Chris Barber band there was Lonnie Donegan playing banjo and singing, and in Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band there were a guy called Bjarne Petersen with the name Liller. And Liller played banjo and sang, and was a quite popular part of the orchestra. He didn't do that Lonnie Donegan thing by going solo. Oh yes, he did that later on, but that was much later. He was in the Bue band for many years, and it was up in the 80s he started a solo career in a bit different genre. Still somehow based on traditional jazz, but more going in a pop direction, you could say, and had a very famous song about what do you call that in English? You know, and when you write in a newspaper to find a partner, I don't know what the English name is, but he had a very famous song about that, about this lady about 40 years old and a bit chubby, looking for a man. And that was very popular in the beginning of the 80s. But that's another story. Let's go back to the good old 50s and the good old days of the Papa Bue Viking Jazz Band. The other members, there were the bass player Ib Lindskov and the bass player Mogens Seidelin, and then two guys I want you to pay attention to because they are very important figures in Danish jazz. and that is the trumpet player Finn Otto Hansen and the clarinet player Jørgen Svare. Jørgen Svare is a fabulous clarinet player. He went solo in the 80s too, a bit later than Liller, but also in the 80s. And I saw him several times playing live back then. As far as I know, he's still alive, but a very old man now, about 90 years old or something. But a few years ago, he made a new album, and he was still a great clarinet player. But then again, let's save that for a bit later and talk about the early days of the band. I mentioned the similarities with Chris Barber's band, and there actually were a friendly bond between those two orchestras. You know, the trad jazz environment in Europe, there were a lot of over borders, and people knew each other and were visiting each other and such stuff. And as I mentioned in the previous video, Bues Viking Jazz Band got very popular in the most of Europe and were touring, well, all over Europe. One of the things Bues Viking Jazz Band did that brought out a lot of discussion, and some were very fond of it and some were very much against it, is that they played a lot of old Danish tunes. And actually that's what musicians have done all through the history of jazz, taking tunes from otherwhere. You know, the old jazz musicians, that many of those songs that became jazz standards were popular songs of the 20s, so-called Tin Pan Alley songs. So, but some people thought that wasn't the right thing to do, that was not real jazz, and that was too much pop, and that was not what they were supposed to do. And the song that really is some kind of center point in that discussion, the one that people either love or hate, is a song called Nyboders Pris. That means the price of Nyboder. Nyboder is a part of Copenhagen, some small yellow houses in the Easter Bridge section of Copenhagen, originally made for people of the Navy, but at some point someone thought that renewing the city, that we should tear those old houses down, and then there was made this song. You could actually say it was an early protest song, sung by a singer called Olga Svendsen, and she sang about that, don't mess with our old yellow houses there. We love them and we want them to stay there. Very old song, I guess from the 30s or something, I guess. And up there in the late 50s, Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band did their version of that song in a kind of trad jazz version. And that is actually on the album that made me begin to make all these videos. That album called The Vikings Are Over Us. It's on that album. Later on, from the late 60s up in the early 70s, it kind of got a trademark for them, and even those who have thought it was fine that they did it with a pair of songs begin to think it was a bit too much. Because now they were making whole albums of just old Danish tunes with not much connection to jazz. And it sort of got into a thing that was not that interesting as it had been. In the early years, some of the things they did were quite interesting, actually. They also took that German tune, Schlafen mein Prinzen. I actually think that is originally written by Mozart, if I'm not completely wrong, and made a jazz version of that. Kind of Kenny Ball inspired, I guess, with those bam 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 that you also hear Kenny Ball do in some of his recordings of songs. But like it or not, they were very popular through all those many years. But then a lot of the original members left the group and were replaced by, well, other guys. Well, but I guess many of those later on was not quite as gifted. Liller, well, he may not have been the greatest banjo player or the greatest singer for that matter, but he was a charming guy. He had charisma, and gave the orchestra some kind of character or trademark or whatever you want to call it. He left, and as I was talking about earlier, he had that big hit with that song. Do you call it a contact ad? A contact ad, when you advertising for a partner. Well, I talked about that song a bit earlier. That was very popular. Then Finn Otto Hansen, I think Finn Otto Hansen left. Yes, he did, because Jørgen Svare was still there when there was this other trumpet player that he actually played together with in another, later on. So yes, Finn Otto Hansen, that great trumpet player, left and played with a lot of other orchestras. Played with actually another band who was led by a trombone player called Ole Lindgren with the nickname Fessor, like professor. Even though he's a trombone player, not a piano player, but he's known to be quite clever and knowing a lot of things about stuff. So I guess that's why they called him Professor. He played with Fessor and he played a lot of other places. He only made one album in his own name in his lifetime, but he's a very well-known and acknowledged trumpet player in Danish jazz. And then, of course, as I said before, there was the fantastic clarinet player Jørgen Svare, who left and started a solo career, still based on relatively traditional jazz, but not traditional in that way as Papa Bues Viking jazz band. It was not that sort of, what would you say, a time capsule, like, oh, okay, now we are back in, God knows how long back it was more like, okay, it's a style, and we can play that style, but we can also do it in a way that is not that kind of nostalgic, but is kind of up to now and nowadays, and it's a style playing, doing it now, and I guess that's what Jørgen Svare did. Actually, he said when he left Papa Bues Viking jazz band that he was tired of playing the same songs the same way again and again. So he got his own band, and as I told before, I saw them many times live, and they were really remarkable. There was a bit of shifting, changing with the bass players, but he had this piano player, Søren Christensen, a young man at the time. Of course, he's not that young anymore, but back there in the 80s, he was very, very young and was some of the new lions on the jazz scene, and my God, he could play. He was really good. And then there was this drummer, Leif Johansson. Fantastic. He had this thing about the cymbal by taking the stick and beating it up in the cymbal. And sometimes he went up, and he was so tight and he was so fast and he did so many brilliant things. And well, some evenings they didn't have the best bass player, but sometimes when they had a good bass player, there is a very famous Danish bass player called Hugo Rasmussen. He was sometimes playing with them. And another one of the great ones, one called Leonard Ginman, was sometimes playing with them. And you know, when you took Leif Johansson and put him together with a good bass player, it was the best rhythm section you could get. It was so dynamic and So brilliant. And on top of that, you had Sir Søren Christensen's piano playing, and of course Jørgen Svare's clarinet. And you know, sometimes he played the theme to a song, and sometimes he just took one, what do we call it, chorus, and with improvisation, and then got down from the stage and let that trio go along, and then he came up there and he just stood there, very relaxed, puffing on his cigarette and looking at those three guys, like he was thinking, well guys, how's it going? Is it swinging? Let me hear. Yeah, it is swinging. That's good. That's good. Okay. Oh, I finished my cigarette. And then he took up the clarinet and he played like hell. I tell you, playing his ass off, and you know his attitude here. Sometimes he has the attitude of going crazy on that clarinet, and he was so great. I tell you. That was brilliant. That was really, really brilliant. It just struck me that something I said a little earlier was not entirely correct, because that effect, using the trumpet and the clarinet going down like bam, 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 using that effect, Papa Bue actually did it before Kenny Ball, because Schlafenmeinprinzen was recorded in 1959, and those recordings, it was actually several recordings with Kenny Ball using that effect, was up around 61, so it was a little later. So Papa Bue was actually using that effect first. Maybe someone did it before them. Maybe some Chris Barber recording from the late 50s. I have a faint memory, some vague idea of having heard some recording with Chris Barber Orchestra from that period using that effect, but I'm not sure. So maybe the honor goes to Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band for coming up with that idea. Maybe. Speaking of which, there's something I would like to put on, that, you know, all this started with that video by Parlogram about releases on Parlophone before Beatles. And something I was not that fond of is that he kind of make the whole thread scene like one thing, and it really wasn't. And talking like Chris Barber Orchestra and the Temperance 7 was more or less the same thing. It really wasn't. Chris Barber's orchestra was a serious orchestra based on that traditional style, but working very creatively and developing their own thing. Temperance 7 was more or less a comedy act, and intentionally sounding like something done in the 20s or something. And I really don't think you can say that these are the two same things. And speaking of Kenny Ball is somewhere in between there. It is, well, they made some quite good recordings, but it is more pop. It is more like doing this happy jazz thing and not really developing much and not that high grade of creativity. Very much just going along and having a good time and such. Not at not on the same level as Chris Barber Orchestra. And how do the Danish counterpart fit in here? Well, that's a good question because, as I told you, Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band took up those old Danish songs in a way similar to when Kenny Ball was playing Midnight in Moscow or My Mommy's Eyes or those kind of things. It was a bit of the same thing. But somehow they, at least in my book, were more a creative platform than Kenny Ball. Maybe not to the same degree as the Chris Barber Orchestra, but still close to. And actually, there were a friendship between those two bands, and they met on several occasions. But when we reach up in late 60s, early 70s, well, there had gone a lot of, jolly for funny time drinking beer and singing along thing in it. And yeah, you could say they have gone a bit too far in that direction. It has always been a rumor that when Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band were playing, they were drinking a lot of beer. I don't know if it's true, but some say they did. But they always played good and correctly. It was not like falling around and such things. That never happened. They were always a very disciplined orchestra. So they may have drank a lot of beer, but they could still play and still stand on their feet. I think that is important to mention. I guess they themselves could see, okay, maybe we are gone too far in that direction. Now it's too much laugh and beers and not much else. And what happened to the musicianship and good playing and actually making music? So a bit later on, in the late 70s, the last half of the 70s, there were a slightly change in the stylistic direction, and they were moving a bit to early swing music, things that were just a little step further than the traditional thing. But sadly enough, it was in the same period they lost many of their best profiles, as I have told you about. But the last album with Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band, Jørgen Svare was on, is actually a quite solid album, and it somehow sets the scene or points in the direction of his solo career. So even though he said at the time that he wanted to do something else, well, it was kind of prepared. The last things he did with Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band was kind of pointing in that direction. But then he took it a little bit further and made his own thing, as I told you about. Well, around the late 60s, early 70s, there was a new member of Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band. I think it is important to mention. A guy called Jørgen Jensen, with the nickname Jønne. He was a piano player, and you know, in the early days, Papa Bues Viking Jazz Band didn't have a piano player. The sound was based on a rhythm session with bass drums and Liller's banjo, and that was the basic sound that the horns were playing to. So it changed their sound when they had a piano player. And there was this thing about Jønne that besides being a skilled player, a very fine musician, he also had this entertainer ability, kind of could connect with the audience and putting on a show and being funny and all those kind of things. So besides having Liller as some kind of star, you know, he sang those songs and all that, and I guess was some kind of crowd holder. Well, suddenly the band also had Jønne, and he could connect with the audience and being funny and entertaining and all that sort of stuff. Well, as you may have guessed by now, I am a huge fan of Jørgen Svare, and I told you about how he could be on a stage. You know, I have always been very fascinated about that man and his appearance, but you know, it's more elegance and being sort of, I don't know the right word for it, but you know, it is not saying and here goes and here's a good story, and that's not Jørgen Svare's style. You know, he's more cool, smoking his cigarette and drinking his beer and looking around and saying, okay, what is going on here? And how does the music sound? Is it swinging? Yeah, I guess it is. Okay. So I guess I go in and make my thing. That's more Jørgen style. So, and in Papa Boo, he was not that much in front. Of course, in some tracks he was, when they were playing a obvious clarinet tune. Of course, it was Jørgen leading on. Like Petit Fleur or something like that. Of course, but not in that. Well, you know what I mean. But they got Jørgen in the band, and he was a skilled piano player, and he was funny and entertaining, and well, I guess you could say that was a good thing they got him. Unfortunately, it was about the same time that they were losing some of the other members. Lila went in and out during that period, up through the 70s. Well, sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't, and sometimes late in the 70s he left for good.